Flight attendant kicked out black pilot. Didn't know she was the airline owner. The jet bridge felt tighter than usual, lined with passengers shuffling toward their seats, some already tugging at carry-ons in the aisle. The air inside first class was warm, faintly scented with brewed coffee and new leather. Every step forward drew a glance, not just curiosity, but that lingering look that measures you against something unspoken. The uniform fit flawlessly, 4 gold stripes on each shoulder, black jacket pressed without a crease, hat tucked under one arm. Each stride toward the cockpit should have been routine. It wasn't. A young man in 2A lowered his phone mid-scroll to watch. A woman in 3B tilted her head slightly, following the path. And then, halfway down the aisle, movement stopped. A beverage cart blocked the narrow walkway like a barricade. Behind it stood a flight attendant, hand gripping the metal handle. Her posture said, "This is my space." Her eyes skimmed the uniform, then settled with a faint smirk. "You can't be here," she said flatly, her voice pitched loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the way they carried the quiet suggestion that the uniform was a costume, the authority imagined. Conversations stilled. A businessman in 1C looked over the top of his newspaper. A child peered from behind his mother's seat. "Excuse me?" The tone stayed calm, but the weight behind it was deliberate. "This area is restricted," the attendant replied, chin lifting, as if to emphasize her own control over the aisle. "You'll need to step back." The cart didn't budge. Neither did the eyes on the surrounding seats. 1 row back, a teenager raised his phone and angled it toward the scene. The faint reflection on the screen revealed he wasn't just recording, he was already live streaming. The attendant's voice sharpened. "Step back toward economy, please." Her gaze flicked to the phone in his hand, then back to the uniform, as though the presence of an audience only added to her certainty. The aisle felt narrower now, the barrier more intentional. Every second stretched, and with it came the awareness that this was no mix-up over boarding passes or seating charts. It was something else, less about procedure, more about who she expected to see walking toward that cockpit door. And that's when she put her hand on the cart, leaned forward slightly, and said the words that made the entire cabin go silent. Before we keep going, if you're watching this right now, make sure you hit subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ so you don't miss any more real-life stories like this. And in the comments, tell me the country you're watching from. I love knowing where our audience is tuning in from around the world. The cart remained between them, unmoving, while every pair of eyes in first class waited to see what would happen next. The attendant's eyes narrowed as if studying a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong neighborhood. She shifted her weight, bracing her stance behind the cart. "You're really gonna stand there dressed like that?" Her tone was coated in condescension. "We've got procedures for a reason. Real pilots don't look like you." The sentence landed harder than any shove could have. Conversations in first class froze mid-sentence. A man halfway through a sip of champagne lowered his glass without blinking. Somewhere in 2A, the teenager's livestream viewer count jumped. The faint ping of new comments drifted into the air like tiny alarms. Zara didn't need to see the screen to know what people were typing. The uniform, the stripes, the badge, none of it mattered. What this woman saw wasn't a pilot. She saw someone who, in her mind, didn't fit the picture. "Ma'am," Zara replied evenly, "I'm scheduled to fly this aircraft. Please step aside." The attendant's lips curled into something between a smirk and a challenge. "Sure you are. Let me guess, you bought that jacket online? Some Halloween clearance rack?" A couple of passengers exchanged uneasy glances. The businessman in 1C cleared his throat, the sound almost an interruption. "She's clearly a pilot," he said. "Maybe you should." "Sir," the attendant snapped, cutting him off without breaking eye contact with Zara, "let us handle this. Some people will do anything for attention these days." The businessman's jaw tightened, but he sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. The live stream camera tilted for a better angle. More phones appeared. Subtle at first, then openly held in plain sight. People didn't want to look away. The air in the cabin grew heavier, every second stretching longer than the last. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be brushed off with an ID check. This was something she'd seen too many times before. a public questioning of competence wrapped in the thin veil of protocol. A memory flashed. Years ago, walking into a flight operations meeting as the only black woman in the room, being told, "Oh, the catering room's next door." The sting of those words had faded over time, but the pattern was always the same. Someone deciding she didn't belong before she said a single word. The attendant tapped the side of the cart, almost impatiently. "Now, before I call security, why don't you tell me what your real job is?" There it was, the switch from questioning authority to questioning identity. It wasn't about security clearance or paperwork anymore. It was about making sure the people in earshot knew who she thought Zara really was. Her gaze swept the cabin. Some passengers looked at her with silent support. Others glanced away quickly, unwilling to be caught in the tension. But the teenager in 2A hadn't stopped filming for a second. His phone reflected the bright cabin lights as a steady stream of hearts and comments scrolled up the screen. One woman in 2B leaned forward. "Young lady, that pilot has been nothing but professional since she stepped on board. Maybe you should check your attitude." The attendant turned sharply, voice firm. "Ma'am, please stay seated. We can't have random people wandering around in uniforms they didn't earn." "Random people?" the woman shot back. "She's wearing captain's stripes." Zara held her ground, but the weight of the moment pressed in. Years of proving herself in silence had trained her to pick her battles, but this battle had an audience, and every word mattered. The attendant looked her up and down again, slower this time, as if daring her to respond. "You think you can just walk through first class like you own the place?" A ripple of irony passed through Zara's mind. Phones continued recording. The businessman in 1C leaned forward again, his voice low but firm. "Everyone here can see what's going on. Maybe you should just—" The attendant ignored him entirely, speaking louder now, almost performing for the audience. "See, this is the problem. People think putting on a uniform makes them something they're not." Her words floated above the cabin, sharp enough to slice through the quiet. Zara's eyes met hers without blinking. "And what exactly do you think I am?" The attendant's smile was thin, brittle. "Probably customer service. Maybe housekeeping." Gasps scattered through the cabin. The woman in 2B covered her mouth. The businessman in 1C closed his eyes briefly, as if restraining himself from saying something unfiltered. Somewhere behind them, a passenger muttered, "Wow." The teenager's viewer count spiked again. A notification tone pinged from another phone. Hashtags were probably already forming. Zara felt the familiar heat rise in her chest. Not anger alone, but the resolve that came when someone tried to strip away everything you'd earned in front of an audience. She could have ended it right there with one sentence, but she didn't. Not yet. The businessman in 1C pushed his seat upright. "Enough," he said, his voice sharp enough to turn heads. "You've made your point, but it's wrong. She's clearly part of the crew." Brittany, the name stitched neatly above the winged emblem on her blouse, didn't flinch. "Sir, please stay seated. This is a matter of flight security." "Security," the woman in 2B echoed, eyebrows raised. "What's insecure here is your judgment." A few chuckles came from the back of first class, but they weren't the kind born of amusement. They carried that uneasy edge people have when watching something they know is wrong, but aren't sure they should speak up. Across the aisle, the teenager's phone tilted higher, catching not just Brittany and Zara, but also the passengers leaning into the confrontation. His screen showed an endless stream of text. "This is crazy. Where's the captain? Somebody help her." The viewer count ticked upward, 28, then 35, then 41. Brittany's voice rose half a notch, enough to project past the nearby rows. "If you don't step back right now, I will call security and have you removed from this aircraft." The businessman in 1C let out a sharp laugh, the kind meant to slice through posturing. "Removed? She's wearing the uniform you just said she didn't earn. How does that even work?" A man in 3A, who'd been silent until now, spoke up without looking away from his tablet. "It works when someone's looking for a reason to make you leave before you've even had a chance to speak." Brittany's cheeks tightened, but she kept her grip on the cart handle. "Sir, please don't involve yourself in crew matters." Zara stayed still. She'd learned long ago that movement in moments like these gave the other person something to work with, a gesture to misinterpret, a step to frame as aggression. She stood as she always did before taking command of an aircraft. Grounded, unshaken, aware of every set of eyes watching, but the weight of those eyes was different now. It wasn't just about curiosity, it was about spectatorship, the kind that made her existence a public debate instead of a fact. The teenager in 2A adjusted his angle, catching the tension from over Brittany's shoulder. "You guys are seeing this live," he murmured, loud enough for the microphone but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't directed at anyone. "First-class drama. Pilot getting blocked. This is messed up." More phones were out now. Some passengers tried to disguise it, holding them low or propping them against the seat ahead, but the glint of a lens was unmistakable. Others didn't bother hiding it. One man in 2C held his up high, thumb hovering over the record button like a trigger. Brittany scanned the rows and squared her shoulders. "All right, this is your final warning." Zara met her eyes. "Final warning for what exactly?" "To step back to economy. We can't have people pretending to be crew, especially not in restricted areas." That last phrase landed heavy, a coded reinforcement of the line Brittany had already drawn between who she believed belonged here and who didn't. The woman in 2B shook her head slowly, muttering, "Unbelievable," just loud enough for nearby rows to hear. A man in 1D, older with silver hair and a posture that spoke of years in formal settings, leaned into the aisle. "Young lady, I've flown more times than I can count, and I've seen many captains in my day. She has the presence of one. You're making the rest of your crew look small." Brittany's jaw tightened. "Sir, please sit down before I ask you to deplane as well." That word, deplane, had a way of flipping a switch in people. A murmur spread among the passengers, some voices rising above the low rumble. "She's not doing anything wrong. This is going to end badly." Zara felt it. That familiar balance between the urge to defend herself and the quiet understanding that anything she said now would be dissected later. The subtle humiliation came not just from the accusation, but from knowing she'd have to lay out proof of her own competence in front of strangers. Proof no one else in her position would ever be asked for. Brittany reached for her radio, the small device clipped to her waistband. "Control, we've got a situation in first class," she said, eyes still locked on Zara. "Possible impersonation of crew. Requesting immediate assistance." The businessman in 1C muttered, "She's doubling down," as though speaking to himself, but loud enough to be caught on the teenager's live stream. The viewer count jumped again, 73, then 89. Comments scrolled so quickly the teenager had to swipe to keep up. Tag news outlets. "This is racial profiling. Post her name." Zara stood silent, letting the words pass over her. This was no longer a single confrontation. It was a moment spilling outward, reaching people far beyond the cabin walls. And then, through the aircraft door, a shadow moved in the jet bridge. A voice outside called for the cart to be moved. She turned her head just enough to see the uniformed figure stepping into view. Not another attendant, but the gate supervisor. And he wasn't alone. 2 security officers walked in behind him, belts weighted with radios and clipped ID tags swinging at their hips. Then I saw the gate supervisor walking toward us, with 2 security officers right behind him. The gate supervisor stepped through the cabin door with the authority of someone used to ending disagreements quickly. His badge read Derek Martinez, and his eyes moved from Brittany to Zara, taking in the blocked aisle and the rows of passengers watching like it was a live courtroom. 2 security officers followed close behind. One was tall with a buzz cut, the other stockier, his hand resting casually near the radio on his belt. Both scanned the scene in the way law enforcement does when they've already decided who the problem is. Brittany's tone softened, but only toward Derek. "We have an unauthorized person impersonating crew. She's refusing to return to her seat and is holding up departure." Murmurs rippled through first class. A passenger near the back let out a sharp, "That's not what's happening." But Brittany's statement hung there, shaping the first impression for the only people with the power to remove someone. Derek looked Zara up and down. His gaze lingered on the stripes, the hat tucked neatly under one arm, the badge clipped to her jacket. For a moment, something like doubt flickered in his eyes. Then it was gone. "Ma'am," Derek said, his voice steady, "I'm going to need you to come with us so we can sort this out at the gate." "She's the pilot," the businessman in 1C blurted, standing halfway up. "Do you hear yourself?" "Sir, please sit down," the buzz-cut officer said firmly, not even glancing at the businessman. His focus was locked on Zara, the way a lens stays on the subject it's been told to capture. Zara didn't move. "Is there a reason this can't be sorted right here? I have credentials." The stockier officer's jaw flexed. "We'll look at them outside. Now if you'll step off the plane." More voices rose in protest. The woman in 2B leaned into the aisle. "This is harassment. She's done nothing wrong." The teenager in 2A didn't stop filming for a second. His screen showed over 120 viewers now, comments stacking in rapid-fire succession. "Get their names. This is racial profiling in real time. Tag the news." The officers didn't glance at the phones, but Zara knew they saw them. It was in the slight stiffness of their movements, the tightening of shoulders when passengers spoke up. Still, their formation didn't break. They were in the habit of siding with the crew member who made the call, no matter how flawed the reasoning. And in their eyes, Brittany's uniform, and the assumption behind it, outweighed hers. "Ma'am, we're asking you to step off voluntarily," Derek repeated, his tone lower now, meant to suggest reason while offering no real choice. Zara stayed still, feeling the press of the moment. This wasn't just about her. It was about every instant someone like her had been told they were in the wrong place, that they didn't belong, and then asked to make their defense in a hallway, while the real story went unrecorded. A man from 3A stood. "You're making a mistake. She's part of the flight crew." The buzz-cut officer's voice sharpened. Everyone remained seated. "We're not debating this." The murmurs grew louder. Phones tilted higher. Someone whispered, "This is going viral already." The teenager's stream hit 170 viewers, then 192. The hashtag Skywing discrimination popped up in the chat. Another 100 seconds later, "Let her fly." Brittany stood a little taller, as if bolstered by the backup now on board. "See? We're handling it. Everything will be fine once she's escorted off." The stockier officer took a step forward, close enough now that Zara could see the tiny scratches on his name tag. He motioned toward the door. "Ma'am." Her mind flicked briefly to the executive card in her briefcase. One flash of that, and this would all reverse instantly. But the thought sat heavy. If she used it now, she'd walk off as the exception, the one with enough power to rewrite the ending. Everyone else in her position? They'd still be out here fighting to prove they even belonged in the conversation. Passengers kept filming. A voice from further back said, "She's clearly in uniform." Another added, "Y'all need to check yourselves." Still, the path to the door stayed open, waiting for her to walk it. Zara exhaled slowly. Every instinct said to resolve it, to avoid a bigger scene. But the bigger scene was already here, being recorded from 3 angles, climbing in viewership, hashtags forming like wildfire. The officer gestured again. "Let's go." She didn't move. Derek stepped closer. "We can do this the easy way, Captain." His voice trailed off as though the title had slipped out by accident. Brittany shot him a look that said, "Don't give her that." Zara met Derek's eyes. "You're certain you want to do this?" He didn't answer. Phones caught the silence. Comments poured in. "They're hesitating." She called him out. "This is about to blow up." Zara's hand brushed the side of her briefcase. The weight of what was inside felt heavier than ever. Not just the card, but the decision of whether to use it. She looked at the passengers, at the cameras, at Brittany, standing with the quiet satisfaction of someone who thought she'd won. They thought they were escorting a nuisance. In reality, they were about to shut down an entire airline. The commotion at the front of the cabin stilled when a new voice cut through, sharp and impatient. "What is going on here? We have a schedule to keep." Every head turned toward the aircraft door. A short woman in a tailored navy blazer stepped inside, heels clicking against the threshold. Her ID badge swung at her side. Paula Monroe, station manager. Brittany's posture shifted instantly, straighter, almost eager. "Paula, thank you. We have an unauthorized person dressed as crew, blocking the aisle and refusing to deplane." The words were fed with the confidence of someone expecting to be validated. Paula's gaze locked on Zara. She scanned her from head to toe, the hat, the stripes, the captain's wings, but her eyes didn't soften. If anything, they narrowed. "And even if you are some kind of pilot," Paula said, her voice carrying just far enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "You're clearly not our pilot. Skywing has standards." The last word dropped like a stone. Gasps cut through the air, the sound sharp and involuntary. A woman in 2B slapped her palm against the armrest. "Did you really just say that?" The teenager in 2A adjusted his phone so the comment was front and center in the frame. The live chat went wild. "Standards? Seriously? Racist much?" She said that out loud. Zara didn't move, but her chest tightened. She'd heard variations of that word her whole life, used in different contexts but always with the same underlying meaning. You don't fit the image we want. The businessman in 1C rose halfway from his seat. "Standards? That's your excuse for humiliating someone in front of a cabin full of witnesses?" Paula turned on him with practiced authority. "Sir, if you don't remain seated, you'll be removed from the flight as well." The threat silenced him for only a second before more voices broke in. Some defending Zara, others muttering in disbelief. Phones tilted higher. Passengers in economy leaned forward to get a glimpse. The hashtag Skywing Standards began appearing in the teenager's live comments alongside Skywing discrimination. Paula stepped closer, her tone shifting to the clipped cadence of someone who believed procedure was on her side. "We can resolve this quickly. Step off the plane and we'll handle your situation at the gate." Zara held her gaze. "My situation?" "Yes," Paula said, the corners of her mouth twitching in a semblance of a smile. "Wearing a captain's uniform doesn't make you a captain. There are requirements, training, and bias?" The question came from the man in 3A, who still hadn't looked up from his tablet. His voice was calm, but it cut through Paula's words like a blade. Paula's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Instead, she looked to Derek, the gate supervisor, for backup. "She's been asked to step off multiple times," Derek said, not meeting Zara's eyes. "We need to keep the flight on time." Zara's mind flicked over the scene. Paula standing as the self-appointed arbiter of standards, Brittany still gripping the beverage cart like a trophy, Derek choosing the path of least resistance, and the security officers maintaining their formation. It was a perfect image of how bias hid behind uniforms, job titles, and the language of procedure. The woman in 2B leaned forward again. "Your standards seem to have a lot to do with skin color. Is that in the employee handbook?" A couple of passengers chuckled nervously, but the truth in her words wasn't lost on anyone. Paula's head snapped toward her. "Ma'am, if you continue to disrupt..." "Disrupt?" the woman shot back. "You mean disagree with what's happening?" The teenager's phone screen was now a wall of furious comments. Someone tagged CNN. "This is embarrassing for Skywing. Fire them all." The buzz-cut officer shifted his stance, eyes darting briefly toward Paula before settling back on Zara. He looked uneasy now, as if aware that the scene was spiraling beyond their control. Paula, on the other hand, still believed she was steering the moment. "Captain or not," she said, "you're not supposed to be here. Let's go." Zara didn't move. Her voice was calm when she spoke, but it carried a weight that made the row behind her fall silent. "You're making a mistake that won't end when this plane leaves the gate." Paula crossed her arms. "We'll take our chances." The businessman in 1C laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "You really have no idea who you're talking to." Paula shot him a glare, but didn't take the bait. She motioned to the officers, who stepped forward in unison. The aisle seemed to shrink. Phones angled higher. Somewhere, a notification sound dinged, another person joining the live stream. The live viewer count passed 300. In the chat, someone typed, "This is going to be their worst PR nightmare." Zara's gaze stayed fixed on Paula. She didn't know she'd just walked into the worst public relations disaster of her career. The cockpit door opened with a soft click. Every head turned as a tall man in the same four-striped captain's uniform stepped into the aisle. Captain Tommy Thompson blinked at the scene before him. Passengers filming, security standing stiff, Paula and Brittany blocking the way, and Zara still in place. His brow furrowed. "What's going on out here?" His voice carried the calm authority of someone used to commanding attention without raising the volume. Before Zara could speak, Derek stepped in. "Captain, we're removing a disruptive passenger impersonating crew." Thompson's eyes swept over the group, then landed squarely on her. The confusion gave way to recognition in an instant. "That is Captain Williams," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "We're scheduled to fly together today. Have been for months." The air shifted. Gasps scattered through the cabin. Someone in the back whispered, "She's the pilot?" Phones tilted higher, recording every reaction. Brittany's face went pale, her posture tightening as if bracing against an impact. Paula's lips parted, but the words seemed stuck for a beat too long. Finally, Paula found her voice. "Well, if she really is a pilot, why didn't she just show proper identification from the start? Why cause all this drama?" It was a pivot so quick it almost cracked the air, flipping the script from accuser to self-proclaimed victim. A few passengers exchanged incredulous looks. The businessman in 1C spoke up. "Drama? You've been humiliating her in front of everyone here." Paula's chin lifted. "Sir, I'm just following procedure. We can't assume someone belongs in the cockpit just because they're in uniform." The man in 3A looked up from his tablet for the first time. "So you assume she didn't belong?" Paula ignored him. "In this industry, mistakes can't happen. We'd rather be overly cautious." Zara's voice cut in, steady but edged. "Overly cautious is confirming credentials when they're presented. What you've done here isn't caution, it's discrimination." Murmurs swelled again. The teenager in 2A shifted his phone for a better angle, live chat scrolling so fast it blurred. She said it. "Discrimination on record. They're done for." Brittany's knuckles whitened on the beverage cart handle. Her eyes darted between Paula, the officers, and Thompson, as if calculating which way the wind was shifting. Thompson folded his arms. "I've flown with her more than any other captain this year. She's one of the best in the company. This should never have gotten this far." Paula's tone cooled. "We can discuss the incident later, Captain. For now, we need to." "Incident?" Thompson cut in. "You've got half the cabin recording what's happening. This isn't just an incident. It's going to be on 1,000 screens before we're even airborne." From the back, someone called, "It's already live!" Laughter mixed with disbelief rippled through the rows. Brittany's shoulders sank slightly, but Paula still held her ground, though the steel in her eyes had thinned to something closer to unease. Derek shifted awkwardly, his earlier confidence replaced by the look of someone wishing they'd stayed out of it. The security officers stayed in position, but even they weren't as rigid as before. Zara stood in silence, letting the noise of the cabin wash over her. She could feel the shift in energy, not a full reversal yet, but the first crack in the wall. She could have ended it now. All it would take was reaching into her briefcase, pulling out the Skywing Platinum Executive card, and watching the entire dynamic flip in seconds. Thompson's confirmation, the uniform, and that card would force everyone here to back down. But this wasn't just about walking through the cockpit door. This wasn't just about proving her right to be here. It was about every passenger watching, every phone streaming, every person who'd ever been told in public that they didn't belong in a place they'd earned. I could have ended it here with my executive card. But this wasn't just about me. The cabin buzzed with a low current of whispers and the muted clicks of phone cameras. Paula still stood squarely in the aisle, arms folded, a silent wall between Zara and the cockpit. Thompson glanced toward her, clearly weighing whether to intervene further, but Zara had already made her decision. She reached into her jacket pocket and drew out her phone. No rush, no dramatic flourish, just the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what came next. "Who are you calling?" Paula asked sharply. "My office," Zara replied, her tone steady. "You'll want to pay attention." She scrolled through her contacts until she reached James Martinez, CFO. The line connected after a single ring. "James," she said, voice low but clear enough for those nearest to hear, "I'm authorizing an emergency system-wide hold. Code 77 Alpha 9, immediate execution. Confirm." There was a pause on the line, then, "Understood. All flights?" "All Skywing flights, until I say otherwise." She ended the call, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and looked up to find Brittany watching her with narrowed eyes, as if waiting for the bluff to crumble. Paula smirked faintly. "That's cute, trying to scare us with phone calls?" A ping came from the gate agent's computer outside the cabin. Then another. The gate agent's face went pale as the departure board over her shoulder flickered, changing in quick succession. Flight 447, delayed. Flight 447, canceled. A moment later, the rest of the board began to follow suit. Orlando, Denver, Chicago, Seattle. Line after line flipping from on time to canceled. A startled murmur rolled through the passengers in the jet bridge, then spilled into the cabin as those near the door started relaying what they saw. The buzz-cut security officer leaned toward Derek. "You seeing this?" Derek was already thumbing his radio. "Control, what's happening to the departure board? We've got multiple cancellations." The reply came instantly, the voice urgent. "All Skywing flights grounded by executive order. We're locked out of the system. HQ's not answering calls." Brittany blinked rapidly, her earlier bravado slipping. Paula, however, still tried to hold her composure. "That's impossible. Nobody has that kind of authority." From the back, a man called out, "Look at her face, she knows exactly what's happening." The teenager in 2A adjusted his phone to catch Paula and Brittany in the same frame. His livestream comments were a flood of disbelief. "She really did it. Flights are canceling everywhere. This is history." Passengers were refreshing their airline apps, holding up screens to show their neighbors the spreading cancellations. The sound of notifications chimed from every direction. The stocky officer stepped back slightly, eyes narrowing at Zara. "Ma'am, who exactly are you?" Before she could answer, the gate agent outside called through the doorway, voice tinged with panic. "All flights. It's everything. International, domestic, everything's down." Paula's smirk wavered. She opened her mouth, shut it, then forced a brittle laugh. "Okay, maybe you made a call, but this won't last. Nobody has that kind of authority, except..." She stopped mid-sentence. The words hung in the air like a dropped tray, silencing even the steady murmur of passengers. Heads turned toward her, then toward Zara. Phones lifted higher. Cameras zoomed in. And then Paula said the words that made the passengers whip out their phones all at once. "That's impossible. Nobody has that kind of authority, except..." All eyes were on Paula. Her unfinished sentence hung in the cabin air, thick with the weight of dawning realization. Even the low mechanical hum from the galley seemed to fade. Zara reached into her briefcase and drew out a small black card, heavier than plastic, the gold lettering catching the overhead light. A subtle holographic crest shimmered at its center. She held it up for everyone to see. "This," she said evenly, "is the Skywing Platinum Executive Card. There are only 12 in existence." The businessman in 1C let out a quiet whistle. Someone in row 3 murmured, "No way." "I carry it," Zara continued, her voice steady and controlled, "because I am not just a captain for Skywing Airlines. I am the majority shareholder and chief executive officer." The cabin went silent. Even the security officers froze mid-step. Brittany's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Paula's eyes narrowed, but her grip on the armrest beside her betrayed the sudden shift in balance. The teenager in 2A angled his phone toward Zara, his live-stream comments exploding. "CEO? This is insane. She owns the airline. From somewhere in the back, a man said she owns the place and you tried to kick her off her own plane?" Laughter followed, not cruel, but incredulous, the sound of witnesses processing a reversal they hadn't seen coming. Zara didn't raise her voice, but every word landed with precision. 18 months ago, I acquired controlling shares in this company through a private equity deal. I've been flying routes personally to understand our operations from the ground up. That includes seeing firsthand the way passengers and crew are treated. Her gaze slid toward Brittany. "Today, I saw enough." Brittany's face flushed, the red creeping up her neck. The earlier confidence that had powered her voice now crumbled into a tight-lipped stare at the beverage cart handle. Zara turned her attention to the larger audience, not just the cabin, but the thousands now watching online. According to federal aviation regulations, airlines are responsible for preventing discrimination by employees. Current case law shows damages ranging from $50 to $200 million for systemic bias. Gasps rippled through the first 3 rows. The businessman in 1C looked almost gleeful. "Skywing," she went on, "processes over 2 million passengers a month. We generate $800 million in quarterly revenue. Customer satisfaction has dropped 12% this year. Discrimination complaints are up 34%. She paused, letting the numbers hang there. Phones recorded in perfect silence. Brittany shifted uncomfortably, her hands now clasped behind her back. Paula's eyes flickered, a flash of calculation as she weighed what her next move should be. Zara looked directly at Paula. You called this a matter of standards. Let me tell you what my standards are. Professionalism, integrity, the ability to recognize competence without prejudice. Those are the standards this airline will operate under moving forward. A smattering of quiet applause broke out in row 2, spreading just enough to be noticed. On the teenager's screen, comments scrolled faster. This is a masterclass. She's running the company and the plane. Fire them today. The stocky security officer stepped back entirely now, his posture shifting from enforcement to something closer to respect. Derek, the gate supervisor, avoided eye contact altogether. Zara lowered the card but didn't put it away. To everyone watching this, in this cabin and online, know that what happened here today is exactly why change is overdue. If this can happen to me, the CEO of this airline, imagine what happens to those without the title or the leverage. The weight of her words lingered. Passengers nodded, some murmured agreement, others simply stared, absorbing the reality that the woman they'd watched being blocked, doubted, and threatened minutes earlier was in fact the highest authority in the building, on the tarmac, and in the air. Brittany finally spoke, her voice barely audible. I didn't know. That's the problem, Zara said softly. You didn't know my position, but you knew I was a pilot in uniform, and you chose to strip that away in front of an audience. She slid the card back into her jacket. This isn't over. Not for me, not for you, and not for Skywing. The businessman in 1C smiled faintly, leaning back in his seat. Guess we're about to see some real change. Zara met his eyes for a moment, then turned back toward the cockpit. But I wasn't here just to make a point. I was here to make a change. The murmurs in the cabin didn't fade. They shifted, low conversations blending with the faint sound of notifications pinging from phones as the live stream spread. It was no longer just a confrontation. It had become a moment with witnesses far beyond these rows of seats. Zara stayed where she was, letting the stillness work for her. She wasn't going to rush into the cockpit. Not yet. This was the moment to make it clear that what had just happened was bigger than one humiliating exchange. She turned toward Brittany and Paula, not raising her voice but projecting it just enough so everyone could hear. Discrimination isn't just ugly, she began. It's expensive, and I'm not talking about the fines or the legal settlements. I'm talking about the cost to the human beings who experience it. The hours stolen from their lives defending themselves, the careers slowed down or cut short, the dignity chipped away in moments like this. Brittany kept her gaze down, her hands now clasped tightly in front of her. Paula's jaw stayed locked, but the color in her face had dulled from its earlier flush. Zara continued. Skywing could lose millions in bookings from the damage already done here. That's measurable, but the loss of trust? That's harder to repair. People will remember this long after they forget the flight number. Several passengers nodded quietly. The businessman in 1C folded his arms and glanced at Brittany with open disapproval. She shifted her attention to the cameras pointed at her. To everyone watching this live, know that change doesn't happen because a company promises it in a press release. It happens when people inside the system refuse to look away. The teenager's phone chat lit up. Preach. She's right. Accountability now. Zara turned back to Paula. You thought you were protecting this airline's standards, but what you really protected was your own bias. You tried to turn that bias into procedure, and in doing so, you've given the public a perfect example of why change is overdue. Paula's lips parted, but Zara didn't give her room to speak. And Brittany, your words were recorded. Not just the doubt you cast on my credentials, but the way you reduced my capabilities to what you think I look like. That wasn't security protocol. That was prejudice, plain and simple. Brittany's head dropped a fraction lower. This is not about revenge, Zara went on, but it is about consequences. Both of you will face disciplinary review, not because I can, but because the integrity of this airline demands it. We cannot ask our passengers to trust us if we show them that trust depends on the color of your skin. The tension in the aisle deepened. Neither woman moved. Zara took a step forward, narrowing the space between them. You should know something. I've been in this exact position before, not as CEO, but as a pilot just trying to do my job. Back then, there wasn't a camera recording the moment. There wasn't a crowd ready to speak up, and nothing changed. Her gaze swept the cabin. This time there's an audience, and with that audience comes accountability. We won't waste it. From the back, someone called out, "Tell them." Another passenger added, "It's about time someone said this." The security officers stayed silent now, their earlier readiness to escort her gone. They were no longer in an enforcement role, they were part of the audience too. Zara straightened. Every person here has a choice. You can be part of the culture that assumes competence until proven otherwise, or part of the culture that demands people of color prove themselves twice before you even listen. Her words landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward, quiet but undeniable. Paula's arms were no longer crossed. One hand now rested on her hip, the other dangling loosely by her side. Brittany's shoulders had lost their rigid lift. "This," Zara said, gesturing to the phones and the watching passengers, "is a turning point, and what we do after this will matter more than what happened before it." She let the silence settle again, the kind that makes people feel the weight of what's been said. Then she took a final step toward Brittany. "And then," she said, her voice dropping to a quieter, almost conversational tone, "for the first time you looked at me not as an inconvenience, but as someone who could end your career." The aisle felt different now. Not wider, not narrower, but charged in a way that made every movement deliberate. The two security officers, once braced to remove her, now stood off to the side. Their posture had shifted from enforcement to neutrality, as if silently agreeing the confrontation was over. Derek, the gate supervisor, avoided her eyes entirely. His radio was still clipped to his belt, but his hands stayed away from it. The confidence he'd carried when first stepping onto the plane had evaporated into something quieter. The awareness that the whole scene had gone far beyond his control. Paula was the first to move. She drew in a slow breath and turned toward the rows of passengers who had witnessed the exchange. Her voice had softened, stripped of the certainty she'd wielded moments earlier. "We appreciate your patience," she said, though her eyes didn't quite meet anyone's. "We'll be making an announcement shortly." It wasn't an apology, it was damage control, the kind meant to smooth over the optics while leaving the substance untouched. Brittany still stood behind the beverage cart, but her hands no longer gripped the handle like a shield. She had stepped back just enough to clear the aisle. It was a small concession, but in the context of what had just happened, it was a surrender all the same. From the second row, a slow clap began. The businessman in 1C, who had been one of the first to speak up, was on his feet now, applauding. The sound grew, joined by others. Scattered at first, then gathering in unison. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The meaning was in the eyes that met hers as she moved forward. Approval, respect, and for some, quiet relief at seeing bias confronted in real time. Zara nodded once in acknowledgement, then stepped past Brittany without a word. The teenager in 2A tracked her with his phone, his live stream comments lighting up in real time. "She's heading to the cockpit. This is legendary. Skywing better change fast." Each step toward the cockpit door carried an irony she couldn't ignore. Hours from now, she was scheduled to present a new discrimination policy to the Skywing Board of Directors, a document she had spent weeks refining, pulling from data, case studies, and testimonies from employees across the company. And now she had something she hadn't planned for. Her own fresh case study, witnessed by a cabin full of passengers and thousands online. She reached the cockpit door, pausing just long enough to glance back over her shoulder. Paula had retreated halfway down the aisle toward the aircraft door, speaking in a low, urgent tone to Derek. Brittany had disappeared toward the galley, the beverage cart now pushed aside completely. The cabin had settled into a low hum of conversation, not the idle small talk of boarding, but the aftershocks of an event that everyone knew would live beyond this flight. Thompson stepped aside to let her pass, his expression a blend of pride and frustration. Pride in her composure, frustration that she'd needed to display it at all. As she slid into the captain's seat, the controls felt both familiar and newly symbolic. Her hands rested on them with the same confidence they always had, but the context had shifted. Today, this cockpit wasn't just about navigation and altitude. It was about presence, the right to be here without question. Through the partially open door, she caught sight of the teenager lowering his phone at last, flashing her a small nod before tucking it away. She knew the footage was already everywhere by now. Clipped, shared, dissected. Somewhere on the ground, public relations teams were drafting statements. Somewhere in corporate offices, phones were ringing with reporters on the line. Somewhere in boardrooms, executives were realizing this incident wasn't going to fade quietly. And in just a few hours, she would walk into that boardroom, not as a CEO presenting a hypothetical scenario, but as the subject of the very problem she was trying to fix. She secured her harness and adjusted her headset, the faint chatter of air traffic control filtering through. Thompson slid into the co-pilot seat beside her, giving her a look that carried no need for words. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead. Passengers began settling in. The applause had faded, but its echo lingered in the air, a reminder that they had seen what happened, and that silence had not been the default reaction this time. The engines began their slow build toward departure. Outside, ground crew moved into position. Inside, the weight of the earlier confrontation remained, but it no longer belonged to Brittany or Paula. It belonged to her. She glanced at the clock on the panel, calculating the time to their destination, and to her next battle, one that wouldn't be fought in a cabin aisle, but in a boardroom with policy and precedent on the line. But the story didn't end when we took off. It was just beginning. The seatbelt sign was still lit when her phone buzzed for the first time after takeoff. Then again and again. It didn't stop. Every notification was a new link, a tag, a forwarded video clip. The teenager's live stream had been shared across platforms: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, even LinkedIn. The caption varied, but the footage was the same. A black woman in a captain's uniform being blocked from her own cockpit and then shutting down an entire airline with a single phone call. In less than an hour, hashtags that hadn't existed before boarding were trending nationwide. Let her fly, Skywing discrimination, she owns the airline. News outlets moved fast. A producer from a morning show sent a direct message asking if she could join via video call before they went live. 2 national newspapers requested statements. Civil rights groups tagged the airline's account publicly, demanding accountability and policy transparency. Even industry insiders, other pilots, flight attendants, and airline executives from competing carriers were reaching out. Some offered solidarity. Others asked pointed questions about Skywing's training programs and leadership standards. The co-pilot glanced over as another notification lit up her phone. "You're going viral," he said quietly, though the understatement made her almost laugh. Her email inbox was worse. It wasn't just the media. There were messages from advocacy organizations offering support, from law firms outlining the potential legal fallout, and from passengers on other flights sharing their own stories of discrimination. One stood out, a letter from a retired pilot who'd spent 35 years in the industry. "I thought things might be different for you than they were for me. Clearly, they're not. But the way you stood your ground today, that's the difference." She didn't reply. Not yet, but the words stayed with her. It would have been easy to frame this as personal vindication, to accept the applause, the media interviews, and the sudden rush of public admiration as proof that she had won. But the truth was, the victory didn't mean anything if it stayed hers alone. In her mind, she was already building the next step, tying the incident directly to corporate policy reform, not just at Skywing, but across the industry. This wasn't about a single bad employee. It was about the environment that gave them the confidence to act on their bias in the first place. That was the real cost. Not just the revenue lost to cancellations, but the human cost of every qualified person made to feel like an imposter in their own workplace. The co-pilot broke her thoughts. "HQ's going to be in panic mode right now." She nodded. "Good. They need to be." Her phone buzzed again, this time with an email from a national coalition of diversity officers in transportation. They wanted to schedule a meeting, urgently. Another ping. This time from a federal aviation official she'd met years earlier at a leadership summit. The subject line was only 4 words: "We need to talk." The messages kept coming, stacking faster than she could scroll. She thought of the passengers who had stood up for her in that aisle. The businessman in 1C, the woman in 2B, the older gentleman in 1D. They didn't know her title or her ownership stake. They had just recognized what was wrong and refused to be silent. That was the kind of courage she wanted to see replicated, supported, and rewarded inside Skywing and beyond it. She leaned back slightly, watching the clouds drift below them. The engines were steady now, the route clear. But the real turbulence, the one she intended to bring to the industry, was still ahead. By the time we landed, my phone had 327 unread messages, most from people I'd never met, all saying the same thing: "Thank you." The boardroom was already buzzing when she walked in. 12 directors sat around a polished mahogany table, their voices low but urgent. Some glanced up as she entered. Others were too focused on the tablets in front of them, scrolling through headlines about Skywing's in-flight incident. She set her briefcase on the table without a word and tapped the small remote in her hand. The screen at the far end of the room flickered to life. No slides, no bullet points, just the live stream footage. There she was, walking down the first-class aisle in full uniform, blocked by Brittany and the beverage cart. Paula's voice rang out in perfect clarity. "Skywing has standards. The gasps from passengers, the protests, the officer's approach, every detail played out in high definition. No one spoke. She let the video run to the moment she made the phone call. The camera caught the departure board switching to canceled, row after row. The room stayed silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the projector. When the footage ended, she set down the remote and looked at each person around the table. "That," she said, "is your case study for today's meeting." A few directors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One cleared his throat as if to speak, but thought better of it. "This wasn't a misunderstanding," she continued. "It was the result of an environment where bias is allowed to hide behind procedure. If it can happen to the CEO in uniform, it can, and does, happen to anyone without the leverage to fight back." She slid a folder across the table. "Inside are the updated anti-bias and equity protocols we've discussed for months. Effective immediately, every Skywing employee, from gate agents to executives, will undergo mandatory training. Complaints will be reviewed by an independent oversight panel, not handled internally." One director leaned forward. "Mandatory?" She met his gaze. "Yes, no exceptions." The chairman glanced around the table. "All in favor?" Hands rose one after another. It was unanimous. She closed the folder and sat back. "Good, then let's address the individuals involved." No names were needed. They all knew. Brittany's behavior was on camera. Paula's words had been broadcast to thousands before the plane even left the ground. Both had violated the very standards they claimed to uphold. "We'll follow formal HR procedure," the chairman said carefully. "But I think we can agree their positions are no longer tenable." She didn't smile, but her voice was calm. "I don't need them in my company if they can't see the problem." The meeting shifted to other matters. Revenue projections, fleet updates, but the air in the room had changed. The footage had stripped away any chance of denial. As she gathered her things at the end, the chairman stopped her at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad you handled it the way you did." She nodded once. "I didn't handle it for me. I handled it for everyone who's been told they don't belong in a space they've earned." She left the boardroom knowing that Brittany and Paula's fates were already sealed. "I didn't need to fire them myself. The system took care of that." The flight that day landed on time, but for her, the journey was far from over. She sat in her office later that evening, the city lights spilling across the floor-to-ceiling windows. The room was quiet now. No cabin chatter, no live stream notifications, no voices challenging her right to be where she was. But the echoes of what happened still lived in her mind. The uniform she wore that morning was folded neatly over a chair. For most people, it was just fabric and thread. For her, it represented years of training, sleepless nights, and sacrifices that few had seen. It was more than a symbol of her role. It was proof of her earned place in the sky. And yet, even with that history stitched into every seam, one person's bias had tried to erase it in a matter of minutes. She thought of Brittany's voice when she said, "Real pilots don't look like you." She thought of Paula's choice of the word standards and how casually it rolled off her tongue. Those weren't just slips of language. They were the polished edges of a belief system, one that had been sharpened over decades and passed down unchecked. The power she had used to end that confrontation, grounding flights, revealing her ownership, wasn't something most people carried in their pocket. And that reality weighed on her more than the confrontation itself. Because the truth was simple. The only reason the story ended in her favor was because she had the leverage to force it. Without that leverage, she might have been just another headline that faded in a day, another person escorted out quietly while the flight went on without them. That was the part she couldn't ignore. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the desk. Power, she knew, was meaningless unless it could be used to protect those who didn't have it. The policies passed in the boardroom were a start, but they weren't the finish line. Real change would come when speaking up didn't require a title, a camera, or a black titanium card. When standing in the right place was enough to be recognized as belonging there. Her mind went back to the faces in the cabin, the passengers who had spoken up without knowing who she was. The businessman in 1C, the woman in 2B, the older gentleman in 1D. They didn't need a title to see the injustice. They didn't wait for permission to call it out. That was courage. That was the kind of allyship that dismantled systems, not just in press releases, but in the moments that mattered most. She turned her gaze to the camera now. Not the one in the cabin, but the one meant for you. "Have you ever seen someone misjudged because of how they look?" she asked, voice steady but warm. "Not because of what they've done, but because of what someone decided they must be." That moment sticks with you. It stays, even after the world moves on. Her tone shifted, firm but inviting. Share your story in the comments. Tell us where you saw it, how it made you feel, and what you did, or wish you had done. Every shared story matters. They remind people that bias isn't abstract. It's real. It's here. And it's something we can confront together. She let the pause linger, enough to give weight to the words. "And if you believe respect should never depend on skin color," she continued, "subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. We tell the stories that too many people want to forget. The ones that need to be heard if anything's ever going to change." Her eyes softened, but her voice didn't lose its edge. Because today it was me. Tomorrow, it could be someone with no cameras, no title, no voice loud enough to be heard. We can't wait for those stories to reach us after the fact. We have to speak in the moment. She reached for the uniform jacket draped over the chair. The gold stripes caught the light as she held it for a moment, then set it back down gently. The day had started as just another flight. It had ended as a lesson. Not about her power, but about the need to use it where it mattered most. And she intended to keep doing exactly that.